project for Global Affairs Canada in Iraq. And we do things in terms of digital governance, which you'll hear about tonight, public governance, board governance. I work in obviously the science and innovation policy space and governance space. So that's a little bit about IOG, and we do a lot of training, a lot of research, and a lot of contract advisory services. So if you have any needs in that space, let us know. And Policy Crunch is our monthly speaker series, which we started last year, and we're very pleased that this year we have the sponsorship of Bell Canada. So thank you, Bell. And every month we take on a particular issue of policy interest. We've looked at various disruptive technologies like AI. We've talked about renewing the social contract for science earlier in the fall. And tonight we are going to be talking about ethics in a digital age. So I'm going to turn things over in a minute to Francois, who will be our moderator, and he will introduce the speakers. But before I do that, let me just cover off a few housekeeping items. If you need a washroom, there's one here. There's also one up on the mezzanine level. Inside the door, there's a big red button. You push that to lock the door so you don't get surprised. If for any reason there is an emergency or an alarm goes off, we can make our way out that door to George Street. Of course, if the alarm comes from Pickering Nuclear Station, we'll just ignore it. But otherwise, we're good. We have Wi-Fi. The account is IOG Guest Network, and the password is I0G Public, all caps, one word. So if you want to do that, we are live streaming this. So usually we at IOG we operate under what we call the Chatham House rule, so that comments aren't attributed to anyone. But this we actually live stream. So just be aware that you are on camera and on audio. We have some snacks and some drinks. What we do typically is we advertise it as being 5:30 to 7:30. That allows for about half an hour of networking and for people to arrive. The actual program runs 6 to 7, and then feel free to stick around from 7 to 7:30. Enjoy some more snacks and some more mingling and networking. Anything else? Any questions, comments? Hearing none, I'm going to introduce Francois, who is our Vice President of Learning, and he will be our moderator tonight.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good evening to everyone. So to introduce the topic tonight, anybody who's old enough here to remember Dick Tracy? Yeah. So my parents were talking to us about him, and he had something really cool. He had a watch that he could talk to. Yeah. Yeah. So we thought it was really cool. And then we were watching Star Trek, where Captain Kirk was talking to his computer. Science fiction. Cool. And then we were all taken by the dream of having visual phone, being able to see your interlocutor on your phone. Let alone it be wireless, And then we're talking about autonomous car and flying cars and so on. That's that thing on the internet these days about flying cars, right? So now that most of these technologies are here with us today, I think we never dreamt that they would also bring their share of problems or challenges. So you could think of privacy, for example. And when I say privacy, you think about Facebook and the use of our personal knowledge. But who thought about the possible challenge of identity theft or breaches like Desjardins, for example? Raise your hand here who is unlocking your phone with your fingerprint. What happened to those fingerprints? I don't want to start a panic here, I'm just saying. There's a risk. What about your eyes? And that biometric information is also being used to identify yourself at the border. So there are ethical considerations of privacy. There are ethical considerations of decision making. Think about decisions that those eventual autonomous car would make in case of a conflict that would lead to an accident. Who would be responsible? Think about all the disruption that technologies like Uber or Airbnb have brought to our society and our public systems. think about all the intellectual property challenges, the economic development challenges, and because we can't avoid it. They're here to stay, and more will come. However, we hope that a good ethical conversation ahead of time will help us make sense of these technologies before they disrupt us, and we allow us to make them help us make a better world for us, make our lives better rather than make them more complicated, more stressful, or more unfair. So tonight, we have three eminent speakers, and I must say, we did have a panelist who was a female. Unfortunately, we had to replace and change the schedule, so we did think about that. I apologize for that in advance. However, we do have some very eminent speaker, Hubert Laferrière, who's a director of Advanced Analytics and Solutions Center at the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. And Hubert is a practitioner of using those technologies for making governmental decisions. We have Louis Perron, who's an associate professor in ethics and philosophy at the School of Public Ethics at St. Paul University, who is going to bring us a theoretical framework for thinking about these. And we also have our very own Ryan Androsoft, who is the director of Digital Ethics Program, the IOG. And Ryan has been active in the field of digital ethics and digital for the last 10 years, Ryan, who's also the founder of the Canadian Digital Service. Sorry for that. So we're going to start by asking each of our speakers to give us opening remarks for a few minutes, and then we're going to open the floor for your questions and your participation. You back?
Good evening, bonsoir. I'm coming from Immigration Canada, and 2 years ago, my team bid to have money to try to mimic the judgment made by officers for what we call visas, issuing visa. And because we were facing an annual growth of 50%, and we didn't know how to manage that, was too much, not enough resources, we add more money. So we did some experimentation, and we showed to the boss that we can manage that. We can manage the growth and the volume. So finally, they created a fund for innovation. We bid for that, and we garner all the money. So it's the second year. I'm closing the project by March. Essentially, what we try to do, what we have done so far, is the following: is we try to automate one portion of the process for people who is asking for a visa. It's called the eligibility. Okay, but at each step, there's a human being there. I want to just make sure that you understand that's making a final decision about that. So there's no final decision made by the model or the machine learning we use. Okay. However, we do a triage, assess the risk, and we recommend ultimately in different bins where this balance could be done. So bin 1, for instance, it's the green bin, so there is a bulk approved by an officer. Okay, so bulk approved by an officer. And so far, we have started with pilots, but the trick is it's live pilots. So we have dealt with China and India for the e-applications, and we have dealt with over 4,000 applications, and about 35% of China e-application were treated rapidly. No mistake yet. So what is a mistake in our case is if an applicant for a visa come to Canada and claim asylum, for us it's a mistake, it's an error. So officers, so it's not a machine, so officers, an immigration officer in the country, when they agree to give a visa to someone to come here for a couple of months, they assess the risk, whether or not that person will be claiming asylum or will overstay. We just can do the asylum, not the overstay. We don't have any mechanism to control that. We have demonstrated that we can reduce by close to 80% the time taken for that portion of that. We have increased productivity, we have reduced cost, and the growth of resource is less important. So for executive, they smile, because we have a tool that will help. More than that, officers, people in the process, love that because it helps them to take time to assess more complex. Because we deal with a simple application, very simple application, not complexity. It's a done deal by officers. So this is what we do. So we started as a bottom-up approach. we didn't create any big framework. We started with the project, we tried to manage. And my first day as a director, I dealt with people knock on my door. I got legal people. Oh, what about the illegality, what you're doing? Are you okay? What about the principle of fairness? Understood fairness. What about the transparency, be able to demonstrate to court what you have done? I got after that people from privacy. Oh boy, that was a challenge. Can you do that? Can you do that? And I'm very, by the way, I'm very provocative, so react to when I say the law for privacy is not adapted to modern technology. So we have to deal with a kind of some difficulty here between the modern technology and some old things. So anyway, and everything, I got my people from policy, we wrote a series of principles that would guide us with dealing with AI or with we use machine learning and advanced analytics. AI, it's very big, so that's where we focus on that, and this is what we have done so far. So on a basis, even this morning, with my team, we were discussing about deployment of the model in production environment, and I told them again, and they know that you cannot deploy a model without looking at the outcomes, the impact of the decision, and what to make sure that we don't have bias, because this is very important. Human judgment is always biased, but also machine can also be biased, so we have to check that. And also make sure that we have done our homework. We're a public organization. We're not a small company, so we have to be very careful about what we do on that. But at no time, I want to be sure about that, the decision is made by the machine only. So what you have read in the newspaper so far, last Friday, in the Vancouver Sound, they have wrong information, and the famous report, Bots at the Gate, that was issued by University of Toronto, by the Citizenship Center, research on what was wrong with information. However, the concerns they have, they were right. Because a machine is a machine, it's not a human being. And we can discuss that, but the machine has logic. En français, on dit un état. I don't know, we say that in English, a being. So we have to understand that because the machine do better than a human being when it comes to do that job. Never forget that. It's increased quality. But at the same time, it do better, it can do worse.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I'm pleased to hear that you're showing ethical concerns because that's the issue. You see, I think that we do ethics all day long, right? So this is a particular instance, some challenges that are raised by AI. I think that what is important is to keep in mind that to have an ethical mindset, we need to look at the larger picture. We need to keep in mind, what are our goals and objectives? What do we want to do with such technology, specific technology like AI? So because at the end, this is what matters from an ethical perspective. What are you going to do with that technology? But if you focus, and the problem is, the danger is to focus only upon the technology, and then you are in danger to forget the larger picture. So the larger picture includes what we call the ends, what we want to achieve with that. So, in your case, for instance, it is the larger picture is certainly linked with what we want to do as a country about immigration, about the laws and the ethical principles guiding how we select the immigrants, how we welcome people in our country. So AI is not going to solve that. You're right. I'm very pleased that we agree. That's one thing. Now, if we go back, so before, as you, Hubert said very rightly, AI is not something that is made, it was created by angels, you know, it's human made. So we ask the machine to do certain things, and this rely on us. And yes, we have to be extremely careful about bias and all that all that sort of things. You know. So it is how we use the machine to which purpose, and it is how we design the machine and what we expect the machine to do. Okay, this has an ethical dimension. Right? And I think, and you alluded to that, maybe what is the most fundamental issue is the capacity to keep control over the machine. Okay, there's a danger to lose our sense of responsibility. You know, the machine will take care of it. You know. It would be so easy. Okay? But this would imply that we forget about that we are free beings. We're dreaming about that kind of, I'm sure you're dreaming about it, you know, that kind of machine that will give all the decisions for you, decide for you, you know, and always perfectly. But nothing can replace our responsibility and the usage of our liberties. And we are dealing, I will just add maybe 2 or 3 things. When we deal with ethics, we are ultimately always dealing with people. The problem is that the machine, any kind of technology, creates like a distance between the user and the people we're dealing with, ultimately. That's a danger, you know, to lose sight of that. This is what we call, in philosophical terms, the existential larger picture. We're dealing with human existence, with human beings, not with objects. Okay? And another challenge is that we keep, and I was pleased to hear that, we need to keep in mind that these are tools, extremely sophisticated tools, but still tools. And the question is raised, and even, you know, when we would like, I think there's a kind of a dream here that we could create the perfect machine that would eliminate all biases, everything that is purely subjective. But I think it's impossible. It is impossible. Because there's always, we interpret the world. See, we design our policies. We design our political frameworks and so on. And this is the same thing for every kind of action that we do. So we need to keep that in mind. You know, absolute objectivity, I think, it doesn't exist. So at the end, as you mentioned, nothing can at the end replace human judgment and the face-to-face encounter with real and concrete people. This is, I'm dealing with you. You want to come in this country. It is you, or you, or you. When I'm looking at the machine, you know, the screen, it's an X, a Y, you know, it's abstract. So we need to always relocate or resituate, you know, what we're doing inside this concrete and human and existential perspective. So I think that at the end there is this, nothing can replace the human judgment. And I will end with quoting a very old philosopher, but called Aristotle. Well, in our world, Western world, it all started with him and his professor Plato, Aristotle. And Aristotle was well aware that our capacity to judge is very special. Very special. And it cannot be as objective as in science or in mathematics, because in those times science was not that developed. But mathematics is, by excellence, an objective knowledge. 2 and 2 is 4. That's it. And he said that pay attention, and a well-learned person, a well-educated person should know the distinction. When we're dealing with ethics, with action and human beings, we're not doing maths. We're not dealing purely with numbers. And I will end here.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight. I wanna throw a couple of thoughts out from my perspective on the topic, hopefully to kind of stimulate some discussion and food for thought. And I'm actually very eager to kind of open the floor up to the audience, because I know there's a number of people who are here who work on these issues and have thought deeply about this. So I really do want to hear your perspective and kind of what you are challenged with as you're thinking about ethics in the digital era. To start with, I guess one of the questions to wrestle with is the question of why this is even a thing we're talking about, right? Ethics has been a consideration in government for centuries. Ethics has been a consideration in human society for millennia, right? And so I think part of, for me, the starting point on this is to kind of tease out, is there something unique about ethics when we talk about digital and talk about technology that's worth us thinking about it differently than we think about ethics writ large, right? And I know many of those who are here today work in government and as public servants. We've had values and ethics codes, conflict of interest laws, we have legal restrictions, we have constitutional responsibilities, again, which have existed for decades, if not centuries. So for me, part of it is kind of us thinking through what is uniquely different about ethics in this digital world that we're moving into. And do we need, I think it's a very open question and a very right question to ask, is do we need a different type of ethics for the digital era? Or is it simply about applying our principles and our ethical standards that we've always had and simply kind of carrying them through? And for me, and I welcome the debate and disagreement on this, I do think there probably is something that's a little bit different in terms of how society is having to adapt to the digital era. I see a lot of parallels, in the conversation we're having today a lot, and tonight, which focuses a lot on artificial intelligence and machine learning and big data, and I think those are rightfully things we should be thinking about. In my mind, there's a lot of parallels to the discussions we were having 10 or 15 years ago around the rise of social media. When I joined government, I had worked previously at Treasury Board Secretariat and worked on kind of early social media policy. A lot of the debate and discussion back then, both internally in government and I think externally in society, was really kind of looking at it very much as just a tool, and how do we kind of tactically use this new social media platform to communicate differently in the government context? How do we kind of adapt some of our different policies to be able to work in kind of the constraints of this new digital way that we're communicating? And I think that's all very fair and very valid. But I think when we look back now, kind of 10, 15 years later on the social media revolution, I think the verdict is, to be frank, that government was largely asleep at the wheel. And aside from the very tactical considerations around how this new disruptive technology was going to change how we communicate, it's actually had some fairly seismic changes to how we as a society operate. On the discussion that we're having now, and frankly some of the damage we're trying to repair now around what it's done around fake news, around lack of social cohesion, is I should be a wake-up call, because I would hate for us to be in the same position 10 years from now when we talk about AI. Because I think AI, is an order of magnitude more impactful than social media is if we think about a disruptive technology. And I think there's a risk that if we view AI as purely a technical challenge, and we don't see it as the more evolutionary or the more you know, kind of exponential challenge that it is, then we risk again kind of being behind the curve on this, on its impact not just on government but on society as a whole. You know, talking about social media for a second, and this links very much to the discussion around ethics, there's a really interesting group in the United States called the Center for Humane Technology. Worth taking a look at. They were launched just about a year ago. And it was a couple of former Google engineers who were concerned, frankly, about the impact that their work was having on society as a whole. And they set up an organization focused very much on looking at how do you actually design digital systems to respect human vulnerabilities. It's a really interesting discussion that they've been trying to start around this, because we often, you know, when we have discussions around things like AI or things like social media or digital design, you know, we think about kind of the Terminator scenario, right, where we've built a technology that has suddenly become more powerful than humans, that can do everything we can do and do it better and faster. And that's, you know, that's worth discussing that by itself. But their point is, and it's one that I increasingly agree with, that there is a point that comes much before that, where technology hasn't surpassed human capability, and in the context of AI, you know, we don't have yet what people call kind of a general artificial intelligence, right? We don't have an AI that you can sit down at a coffee shop and have a conversation with. We may get there. There's varying debates about how quickly we're going to get there, and some say it's 5 years away, some say it's 50 years away, some say it'll never happen. But their point is that there's a much earlier point where technology exceeds our vulnerabilities as humans. You know, and some of their work has been focused on the social media side of it in terms of looking at, you know, the gamification of a lot of our digital systems, right? The very real issues that are coming up around cyberbullying, around addiction to digital, you know, addiction to our smartphones, right? In terms of, you know, the way, the kind of very negative things we see around how social media is designed to kind of want you to get that, you know, the adrenaline hit and the endorphin rush to be able to get more likes and kind of all the negative cycles that come from that. And so I think that's a really interesting concept, is we have to think about technology not just in the context of, you know, the technical challenge of how we use it, but that us as human beings have failings and vulnerabilities. You know, as I think both panelists said, one of the benefits of technology is that in theory it doesn't, right? But the flip side of that means we have to be conscious that we are increasingly working in a world where we are interfacing, machines are part of us. You know, Francois was talking about kind of thinking about sci-fi, you know, back in the day, and you know, you think about kind of older sci-fi and the notion of a cyborg, right? You know, kind of this human-computer kind of mix, and we always thought about it, you'd have kind of a, you know, robotic arm and an eye implant, whatever that looks like. But I kind of argue we all, without knowing it, became cyborgs over the last 10 to 15 years, because every single one of us, I bet, has one of these in your pocket. And I'm willing to bet if I took this away from you right now, you would have trouble doing a lot of things in your life, right? I mean, I can't remember any phone numbers from before 20 years ago, right? Because they're all in here, right? It'd be tough for you to know what's in your calendar. There'd be a whole bunch of things that you've kind of like pushed out of your brain because you've outsourced it to this device, which has become symbiotic with you. And I would think for most people, you know, their smartphone is usually not more than arm's length away from them 24/7. And so it's interesting how, you know, those kind of sci-fi predictions never kind of turn out to be what we think they're going to be, but they end up having huge impacts on us. And so I do think it's important in this discussion around kind of ethics around digital that we realize that digital, it becomes not just kind of a technical challenge, but it's increasingly impacting us as humans and kind of potentially exploiting our vulnerabilities. So I want to just mention two last things before we kind of open it up for discussion. So I do think what this means is that it's inevitable that government is going to have to govern artificial intelligence. It's going to have to govern our use of digital technology. These are questions that kind of, you know, I think go beyond our existing operating rules, and governments are going to have to grapple with this one way or the other, whether it's proactive or not. And there's been, you know, initial starts in doing that. Federally, the Treasury Board Secretariat has new directive on automated decision making, which comes into force on April 1st. Canada's actually been largely viewed as a leader in terms of, from a government perspective, trying to think through the rules around using AI in government. There certainly have been a number of groups, you know, both kind of technology organizations, academics, and others who've been coming up with codes of ethics around how do you manage the use of these very disruptive technologies. And I think it's good that they do that because one of the big differences around the use of tech in government decision making is that when things go wrong, they go wrong at scale. And what I mean by that is that if a human makes a mistake, humans make mistakes all the time, it only impacts, a relatively small number of people in terms of their reach. But as we start embedding AI systems and embedding computers and robots essentially into our workplace, it means if something goes wrong, if there's bias in that system that gets perpetrated, if they make poor decisions, they can suddenly impact millions of people in the blink of an eye, right? So the risk of something going wrong is much higher. And it does kind of raise this interesting challenge for government. So for all of human history, governments have made laws and policies for other humans, right? Our laws and policies are designed to influence human behavior. I would argue, if we're not there already, and in Hubert's shop he kind of is, he works with a robot every day, right? You've got AI as part of your team. I think for a lot of you here, in the next decade, you're gonna have public servant colleagues who aren't human, right? You're gonna have some kind of automated system that is kind of as much of a public servant as you are. And so for the first time ever, we're gonna actually have to write laws and create policies, not just for humans, but for robots as well. And that may require us to think about how you structure and how you design laws and rules in a very different way than we would when we're dealing only with human beings in the mix. My last point is this though. So as much as I think there are very big cautions and there's reasons why we're trying to have discussions like this tonight, I think we need to be careful too, not to be too pessimistic about this, because I think we can also lose sight of the fact that there's incredible potential that can come from some of these technologies. And so, the flip side of it is this, that if you get it right, in the same way that AI can do harm at scale, it can also do good at scale. And when we get into the discussion sometimes, there's often this discussion about we want to see in the black box to understand how the AI makes the decision. Well, here's kind of my counterpoint to you. Every human being who works in government or has to make a decision, they have their own black box between their two ears, right? Everybody, people can say why they made a decision, they can have certain rules that they follow, but human beings are fallible too. They have their biases, they make their mistakes on things. And I think it is problematic if we're going to hold computers to a higher standard than we hold human beings. We talk about self-driving cars, and every time Tesla's doing an experiment and there's an accident, people kind of freak out. But people are horrible drivers, right? in the United States, 30,000 people are killed a year in car accidents. I think it's around 3,000 a year in Canada. But for some reason, and by all objective measures, self-driving cars, even at their early stages, are safer than human drivers kind of per kilometer driven. Yet for some reason, we're much more comfortable being killed by a person than we are being killed by a robot. And as robots, I use robot as kind of a general catch-all for all of these tools. As robots become more integrated in our lives, we're gonna have to kind of renegotiate how we feel about technology, because if we only take an alarmist view, I think the other side of it is we risk missing all the potential benefits which can solve some real social harms. So I will leave you with that, and I'd love to hear some discussion and comments.
So, if you don't mind, I'm going to take my moderator privilege to ask the first question. But that's going to be your turn. So, think of what you'd like to ask to our distinguished panel. And I'm going to start, gentlemen, since you all talked about this in some shape or form, about where does human decision versus machine decision start and stop? I'll give you an example with a very basic and non-intelligent technology. Les radars photo, c'est quoi en anglais, excusez-moi? Photo radars. Okay, so there's been legal challenges about photo radars because some people say you have to have a human being who's witnessing the infraction to hand a ticket. And it's been up in courts. So as a citizen, I want to make sure that a human being gave me the tickets and was using his judgment for that. As a taxpayer, I'm not sure if I want to pay the cop on the side of the road to give me to print tickets, So there's that challenge for something that relatively trivial, are you speeding or not? It's a yes or no decision. But for anything that's more complicated, where does, Louis, you were telling us there has to be a human somewhere in the process because we lose sight and we lose that judgment. Yuba, you're telling us about the fact that, it can help and can be better in some cases. So where does it start? Where does it end? In which cases should we give more leeway to computers? In which cases should we hold back?
Well, first of all, like payment ticket, if there is a difference, and it's always a if, because I'm not sure quantity change the nature of the quality of what is done. But we have to be very careful about what I'm saying. When a machine is taking information, it's dealing with many data and many factors. A human being is limited. So you will have a series of data, a series of factors to consider, and you will use that to make a decision. A seasoned officer have more experience, knowing the context and like that, will be able to have a judgment, but again, it's restricted in terms of using data and using factors. The machine is not limited. And when we, first time we developed the model, we determined the factor use for decision by the machine was not the same as the human beings. And that's why we cracked the black box that people have in their head.
Yep.
Exactly, the black box for us was the people in their head. We didn't know how they justify what's in the judgment or their call on that. And when you contest, you go in court. Some of us have some difficulties to explain. But anyway, but at the same time, the machine can have bias, and the bias is based on what? On the sample we use. And in our case, we trained the machine with over 250,000 calls, judgment, approve and did that. Our question is, what is the composition of the population of officer? If you end up with white male between 25 and 35, you have a bias. Does the machine change that? Not at the beginning, but the machine, and this is where I find it very interesting, through analysis, a machine can change the bias. So that's very interesting. But again, my question is the quality change? You, and just finish on that one, you raised the issue about what is new about machine learning like that. Is it the fact just because we have more powerful computer, more powerful chips and more data that we assist a change of paradigm? I'm not sure. Je suis pas sûr de ça because it's still computers. It's still artificial intelligence. The word started in the 50s, okay, with Alan Turing. So nothing is changed. It's just the method changed. Now, is the method bring you to another quality, a different things? One day I will say yes, the other day I will say no. I don't have an answer on that one. I don't know yet. C'est pour répondre à ta question, I don't know. Okay, I'm not sure. I can give you two answers or give me more beer. I will have it. I can change my story overnight.
That sounds very philosophical after all, eh? No, I'll answer to your question by a personal story. It's about medicine. You know, is medicine a science? It is certainly in part, but it is said also that it is an art. Right? The diagnostic that the physician will give is a judgment, and well, errors can happen. You know, at my last checkup, I was surprised because now, of course, my doctor is using computers and was wondering if I should need a pill, a certain pill, and was looking at his computer, you know, my age, my style of life, my genetic antecedents, and so on. And finally, the machine, you know, was going into a certain direction, but I was thinking, is it the kind of medicine that we will be experiencing more and more? And you know that it is often the case. You know, what do the physician do? Physician, well, get that exam, get that MRR, and they look at the results. And I was just thinking about before, you know, and what some new physicians do, and are going back to that. But the good old, you know, because you know the computer it's statistical. I mean, because I'm this age, because. Well, but maybe I'm still an individual, a specific case. So my question is it possible just by looking at the computer to avoid that evaluation, which is a judgment, where of course the physician may fail after all. We all know these horror stories. Right? You're fine, see you in 2 years, and you're dead the day after. Or it's just a little flu, no problem.
Yeah. Two thoughts on this. So I think the simple answer, kind of this notion of human interaction with AI, there's clearly kind of levels of complexity, and even the Treasury Board rules they've laid out, I think they have 4 different levels of complexity on that. And I think that's a simple way, at least in the here and now, to think about it. Is there are certain very kind of transactional areas where there really are, they're math problems essentially, right? You think about eligibility for a lot of government programs, right? It's essentially just a math problem of, legislation clearly spells out, here are the 6 different criteria you have to meet whether you're eligible, and they really are yes or no questions. And I think in those cases, people tend to be fairly comfortable with AI playing a bigger role to kind of speed up processing times. And I do think in the short to medium term, the real potential that I see already, and I think will be kind of increasingly coming on the pipe, is where AI or other types of kind of digital interventions can speed up the very routine cases and have human beings focus on the complex ones. Because inevitably, you always have this long tail of 10 to 20% of cases are going to have mitigating factors, are going to be complex. And the reality is today, everybody's always short-staffed, everybody's always short on time, and so if we can free up human beings to deal with the much more complex cases, that in my mind is kind of a win-win for everybody and is a good thing in terms of service to citizens and in terms of the effectiveness of how we run government services. I do think though longer term, I tend to always be kind of a techno-optimist in that I do think technology kind of continues to advance. I think certainly in our lifetimes, and maybe much quicker than that, in the next decade, let's say, we could be in a world where there are advances that move fast enough that the AI starts being powerful and reliable enough that it can get into those areas that have a lot more kind of gray zone in terms of analysis on that. And that's where I think the tricky part's going to be, right, in terms of how much we're willing to turn over to that. I think too there will probably be some generational component to this, and we see this a lot with technology adoption. As almost everybody who's here in this room, right, some of the technologies we have today, you had to kind of adapt to, right? And so let's even just take again social media as an example. Everybody in this room is older than 10 or 15 years old, so all of you had to kind of learn how to use social media as a tool, so it's not something that you were kind of born into. Right, but for the newest generations that are coming in, when something has always been there from the time they've been born, their comfort level with it is much higher. So if you think about kind of the next generation to come, who might they're not just born digital, but they might be born into kind of what I'll call an augmented world. They're probably going to have much more comfort with machine-driven decision making because they have grown up with that their entire lives. And so I do think there will probably be a generational component to how this debate and discussion evolves over the next decade or two. And it's interesting, we work with Ipsos a fair bit in some of our coursework here, and we often get them to come in and talk about some of their public opinion research on Canadians' views on technology. And some of the questions Ipsos asks them is around their comfort around AI. And what's interesting is people, and this is what people say, not necessarily this is the way it should be, but people are more comfortable actually with, for example, AI being used to make court decisions around sentencing than they are for it to be used for determining health benefits. And the reason why is Ipsos tells us when they do the focus groups is because most people don't think they're ever going to be convicted of a crime, right? So they're like, if it's going to go deal with those people over there, we're fine to do it. But I don't want AI deciding on my health benefits. I want a human being I can go complain to, right? And so we got to recognize that too. That the way people their instinct in terms of how they think about this stuff might not align with the ethical framework we want. And so there's going to have to be, it will not just be as simple as whatever kind of the majority wants we're going to go with. There's actually some pretty deep discussions we're going to have about fairness and bias and where it's appropriate and how quickly we can kind of adapt to using some of this.
Thank you very much.
So I have 3 questions. So I'll ask rapid fire. You can choose to answer all of them, or one of them, or I hope not any of them. So I think my first question would be, why are we not focusing on automating the boring stuff to make people faster? Why are we focusing on these big flashy things? Well, we could be automating things that are really boring and really mundane to make people faster, especially in the public service, so we don't have to focus on that. So why are we not doing that? Other than like, it's not interesting, but why are we actually not doing that? I think one of the things we touched on, Ryan, was who's making the technology. I think is a huge thing. If you look at Twitter, clearly Twitter was designed by white men for white men to use, and we're seeing the impacts now, which are really terrible. And my third opinion would be about public-private data trust. We're seeing that with Sidewalk Labs, and what is the role of government to play in data trusts?
Question one, we do. To your question, we do things to go faster. We do things to make it simpler. We do it to make it more easier for the client to use that. In addition to that, we enhance integrity. So we do everything. It's amazing. Okay, I'm amazed by what the technology can offer to you to do that. That's what we do. So we do that. And most of my colleagues are doing that. The problem is we're late. Very late. And us, we have the audacity to go without having a net underneath us. So we take a lot of risk and try to have the pilots and do what we have to do. It paid a lot, but we were confident. And I'm not saying because my team is young, I'm older than them, very old, I can be their father. Grandfather now. When I have 24, you have people 20 years old, and wow, it's amazing. I'm always amazed. Anyway, but the thing is, this is what, and most of people in government in the AI shop that I know are going for that. Except CRA, we want to be sure they can catch everything. That's another debate.
Yeah, I'll say, I think there are efforts I know of to automate the boring stuff. I think it doesn't get as much attention sometimes because it is kind of viewed as routine. I know of a couple examples in terms of like financial teams who are using AI to kind of like very kind of mundane, you have somebody kind of cutting and pasting from Excel spreadsheets and they're using that to just kind of, speed those processes up. And I think there'll be more of it. The reality is though, the things that people tend to talk about and that senior management tends to get excited about are the flashier things, which to your point may not be the higher productivity parts of it. Your point about who builds the technology is a really important one. And I think it's a good one to bring up. And I kind of think about often, so in the work that I'm doing now, a lot of my work here with IOG is around taking policy folks in government and helping to train them on digital, right? So that we can have higher digital literacy amongst, government employees. I think the flip side of that is I would love to see universities take computer science and data students and teach them about public policy. Because the reality is, Silicon Valley is making public policy decisions, but none of them are thinking about it that way. And to your point, the design decisions behind a platform like Twitter or a platform like Facebook, or the design decisions behind a lot of these new technologies that are coming down the road are going to have huge impacts. And I actually don't think it's in a lot of cases necessarily malicious, but it's just people have huge blind spots and they're not even thinking about it, right? And they're viewing these things as an engineering problem and not recognizing that they're actually de facto making public policy choices about how they design these systems. So it's a great point, and I would love to see universities, take this on more, because I think as we train the next generation coming in that on both sides of that divide, people on the public administration, political science, policy world have to understand digital better, and people working in tech have to understand the implications that have in the broader society.
No, I think that your questions have been answered. Who was ever like?
I'm just wondering if you could talk to, at the beginning somebody talked about, fingerprints and eye identification in technology. I have a set of twins. They're fraternal, and believe it or not, they open each other's phones, and, at first one could and one couldn't. Technology learned that the other one was similar, so it opened it now, so both can open it. So there's these kind of things that if we start to use them, that we really need to be thinking about how machines are doing things and learning. And I'm wondering if any of you could talk to that. The other thought I had as I was listening, is around education. You're talking about the generation that will grow up with this kind of technology. So what do we need to be teaching them that they're not learning? They will be really good at this stuff, but will they have the ability to question and do things the way perhaps a previous generation did? So what should we be thinking about our education systems? Because as you say, we're late to the game. Well, if we're not thinking about the education of the kids that are being born this year and what we need to build into our education systems, how are we going to be ready for them for the future?
Nobody wants to answer that one?
No, I think we're gonna get a couple of questions and then we'll do them all, yeah.
Two questions. First of all, comment on your proposition, Ryan. You pointed out, here's an intelligent thing and affects what we do in our policy. But I would go further, even beyond that, because the whole paradigm of the Internet of Things is extending that, because now you have intelligent devices, intelligent cameras, sensors, etc. So your whole environment, something called ambient intelligence, is now coming into play, and policies that used to deal with human-to-human behaviors, restrictions, boundaries, and separately with property, now you're dealing with the physical world being animated and intelligent. It's blurring the line between our interactions with humans as intelligence and our physical environment as intelligence. So, I ditto that. In fact, I actually wrote an article today about that. I have a question for Luis. You said that humans can't, nothing can replace human judgment. That's the term you used.
Well, so far, yeah.
So I'm just wondering what your definition of judgment is, because judgment is like an evaluation assessment. So maybe the values or the standards or expectations that they can't replace.
Could you repeat?
I guess my question is, what is your definition of judgment?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, we're gonna take the other question just because we have time.
Yeah.
Good evening. I was wondering if we can, even for the benefit of this question, narrow the scope a little bit and maybe illustrate what is the ethical risk of AI in the public policy sector. So maybe to illustrate with some examples what this means. Because colleagues at immigration, to me, that is just automation in my sense, and it is a natural evolution of technology and where it's going. So where is this ethical risk, and what is the ethical risk we're talking about? Maybe to clarify and identify it first, and maybe also to comment on what is the risk on behalf of the government of Canada and Canadians in general if we don't keep up with AI from a government perspective.
Yep.
What is happening if we're falling behind, or what would happen to our public policy system if we fall behind?
Louis, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, maybe you asked the question about education, right? And well, I think that we, as Ryan mentioned, we need to promote digital literacy the more we can, but we also need to promote and to teach the critical skills. I mean, we need to keep that liberty of ours. I mean, we not to surrender entirely and totally to AI or whatever technology. I mean, because and I think with your first question, the more we develop these technologies, the more we create new problems. Like I think your first question, it's an illustration of that. There is an experimental component. We discover new problems, and this is one of the reasons why we are often behind, ethically speaking. It is because it's hard to anticipate the problems. The problems, they do arise, they emerge when we're doing things. Like, I will just give an illustration related to my domain. it's amazing now, you know, all the information you can get. You know, when we ask our students to do some research, well, you know, you now go to the website of the library. You know, there's a danger to become crazy. So, and I don't know if it helps our students or not, because you know, when on a certain topic you have a suggestion of 1,000 books, 10,000 articles, what do you do?
Get an AI.
It is far more complex than to manage 3 books and 3 articles in 3 different journals. So that's a new problem. And it raises certainly the critical question. And this is part of my job, certainly. There was another question. Oh, the judgment. Well, extremely hard to explain. No, I mean, especially in action, you know. Well, we have a tragic illustration of, you know, soldiers in the field. They have to make judgments all the time. And in Iran, they did a mistake. Because the machine was telling, well, there's a flying object. Well, it is something that implies a part of subjectivity. And I will illustrate that again by relying on my experience. I'm teaching philosophy. This is not mathematics. And sometimes, and students today, well, could you justify your mark? And I tell them, well, I can justify the difference between A plus and C. But between A plus and A, maybe another day I would have given a slightly different mark. It's like, you know, you balance a lot of factors, you put them into the balance, and you have to make a decision without any kind of mathematical certainty, with the risk to make an error. You have to, I think that there is an existential part, and I mean a commitment. I judge that you deserve an A, not an A, or a C. I'm sorry, but your paper worth a C.
Is it like intuition? Is that another word you could possibly use for that?
Oh, it is intuition with a lot of reason, because you need to give justifications for your judgment. But I would just end with that, because that's a very important question. It is not, again, a perfectly rational judgment, I think. In human affairs, I think we are facing limitations.
To answer to your question, we pretend we may make the judgment officer, the call they make on application. So there's no difference. Because we have more factors, more data. This is what we pretend to do. I'm not saying we can have a debate about the difference, but practically, there's no difference. To answer your question, and just paging here because I had an answer about policy. Currently, a lot of organizations like CIO, Montreal Declaration on AI as an example. I know in Toronto, they have an ethics AI center lab there. They are putting in place, and we have done the same thing, principles related to AI. When you read that, essentially they are conservative principles. So the ethical where you're dealing with, it's I call ethical of conformity. We want to preserve what we know. problems, the future, we don't know. That's the issue, and that will be the struggle of policy. But be sure currently what we're doing and government is doing, and what we're doing is to become, it's a conservative approach we have, because this technology is pushing some limits to a certain degree. But again, I go back to my question, and this is, I have no answer for that. What is the quality? What is the new quality that energy brings? We have to ask ourselves, because the policy will change the day we will both identify this is the new or something like that.
Yeah, and just a couple of quick responses to the question. So I think on the question of education, you know, and I think as was kind of hinted at a bit, I actually think kind of humanities and philosophy and critical thinking skills become increasingly important, right? Because yes, you need to kind of understand how the technology works, but you've got to be able to kind of think very critically and philosophically about some of these issues. And so that's, you know, it's a bundle of skill sets that we've almost kind of pushed aside a little bit, and I think they actually become increasingly important as technology plays a more central role in our life. Walter, on your kind of point about the Internet of Things and, you know, that automation, part of what also makes me think about is, you know, how we create our laws and our rules increasingly are going to have to accommodate machines being part of that. And there's an initiative that some folks from New Zealand are kind of spearheading, but that others, including folks from Canada, are involved with, talking about law as code. And essentially they're looking at how do we actually, because right now, you know, the way laws are written, like actually physically written, are designed for humans to consume. And as we're increasingly moving into a world where digital services or kind of digital actors, you know, your fridge is going to talk to Loblaw's ordering department, right? They have to kind of talk to each other. It's actually this notion of maybe we need to rethink how we write laws, how we write regulations, how we write policies, so they're actually written in a machine-readable way that increasingly, because those decisions and interactions are happening between automated systems and not between people, we have to actually kind of think about how to create these things in a different way. And on the question around public policy, you know, going beyond just the automation of a task to a public policy challenge, I'll just, you know, one example to kind of illustrate how I think about this. So take self-driving cars, for example, right? So there's a technical challenge around how you're using AI to make sure the car, you know, navigates the road, obeys, you know, the speed limit, obeys kind of all the traffic, you know, municipal, provincial, federal regulations. That's a technical challenge around using artificial intelligence. But there's also a public policy challenge, in particular of some of the edge cases, and the one which I'll put up there is, you know, people talk about sometimes, what if the car has to make a decision in an emergency situation who it's going to run over, right? It's, you know, in philosophy it's called the trolley problem, right? You've got two paths to go. And it's, you know, this doesn't happen obviously all that time, but occasionally there's an accident happening, an emergency thing. The car is going to have to make a decision, does it swerve left or does it swerve right? And if it swerves left, you know, it kills the old couple who's crossing the road, and if it swerves right, it kills the young child, right? And these are things as humans, we kind of make instinct decisions, which we can't even necessarily tease out, and our legal system is kind of designed to do that. But when you're talking about an autonomous vehicle, someone somewhere is programming in for it to make a decision about who do you kill in an extreme situation. And those are very tough public policy issues that we've spent centuries as humans kind of coming with a legal code to deal with. And it kind of actually goes to the earlier point, if we don't recognize that the design of these technologies has real kind of legal and moral implications, then some software designer is going to kind of put a line of code in there that actually, you know, years down the road will have huge ethical, you know, implications in terms of someone potentially losing their life, right? And so those are the kind of things where I think governments have to be thinking about them ahead of time, so that we don't get in a situation where, you know, 2035, we suddenly realize that someone kind of made a very technical decision into a system that now impacts millions of people's lives. And we've got to kind of work our way backwards from there and kind of come up to the ethics afterwards. So that's why I think these conversations are important to have now, versus just being reactive once we actually have to deal with the outcomes of it.
Do we have time for one last question?
Very quick.
Very quickly? Very quickly.
Well, me and quickly.
You did not choose it.
So,
Quickly.
I'm trying. So here is my question. Are we ready for the artificial intelligence hack? We know how much trouble, just a simple hack can do in a current situation without involving AI. Are we ready? Are we ready for some, and I'm not talking the hack of this driverless car. I'm talking big. As I read somewhere, stock exchanges than by humans. So somebody hacks, deep hack, not superficial, that will kill that will stop the exchange for a day or two. I'm talking change the algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Are we ready for that?
Very quickly, gentlemen.
Short answer, do we need one? Do we need one? I don't think so. Oh, I thought it was like, that's
Somebody
nice. So I'm just sea
from
level,
AI.
I'm just sea level, sorry. Okay, 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 let me think about that.
Well, I would say up to a point. You know, because it would be like, what we've witnessed throughout the centuries about crime and so on. You know, when you install the latest version, the best protection, somebody is already trying to crack it.
Yeah, and I think the short answer is no. I mean, we're not ready for it right now. And the only way,
I was trying to be a little bit more.
no, it's okay, I'll be the pessimist, I'll be the pessimist. But I think the only way we're gonna be ready for it, to be honest, is if you're in a situation where you have kind of an AI being hacked or being used maliciously against you, you're gonna need an AI on your end to be able to respond to that threat. Cause that's the problem, is that if you have an AI trying to take down the stock market, it becomes a problem that is too fast and too big for humans to deal with, right? And so I personally think the world we're gonna get into, in the same way that right now everybody has a cell phone in their pocket, I would argue 10, 20 years from now, you're all gonna have kind of a personal AI bot that's kind of your augmentation, right? Because you're gonna be dealing with everybody else's AI. Governments are gonna have, there'll be kind of a Canadian AI that will deal with interactions with other governments' AIs. And that's a really weird world to think about, but just given the asymmetry otherwise, I don't know how else we're gonna get there unless we kind of have this symbiotic relationship, so.
There are currently efforts to hack systems. We've been attacked, okay, to gain the model, not this different system, but we're gaining, and we have to react to that. So you're looking for the big one, and just to finish on that, we'll say, let's the sun explode with the real life. Everything will go down. But the thing is, probably not, and not this, in the sense that it's optimistic. We're already living that every day in our life. Everybody and people dealing with that in a certain manner. But I know what you mean.
And I'll just add, if you were at our cybersecurity workshop, Policy Crunch, people there talk about using AI to find hackers. So we're in that kind of world. So thank you very much for being with us today. I think you can see we're just scratching the surface of a very complex